welcome to the 32nd episode of Moving Forward on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm your host, Rob Simons. On this show, we discuss what is going on in the world and what we can do moving forward. When it comes to the environment and the impacts of climate change, the one phrase that jumps to mind is faster than expected. Climate change and the sixth mass extinction is impacting our planet faster than many expected. Today we are going to be talking to someone that is bringing this to the attention of more and more people around the world, and at the same time is pressuring governments to act on this knowledge. Our guest is Clare Farrell. Clare is one of the many founding members of Extinction Rebellion in the United Kingdom. She's a longtime environmentalist, designer, and product developer, and an educator on the topic of sustainability and textiles and fashion. Clare, welcome to Moving Forward on the Progressive Radio Network.
Hello.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. And I knew once I heard you talk to the BBC about the Extinction Rebellion movement that you helped found that I wanted to have you on. I thought that was a very interesting exchange that you had with the reporter over there.
Yeah, thanks. It was a very strange thing for me, actually, really, to be on the BBC News, to be honest. It was a bit of a surprise. I sort of didn't know that I was going to be doing it until about an hour before or something. So, yeah.
Well, and the thing that I appreciate about what you're doing and what Extinction Rebellion's doing is the fact that you kind of saw the exchange happen between you and the reporter, is that everything you brought up, it seemed like the economy followed. And, you know, what about these jobs that are really destroying our environment? It was almost as if that was as big as a concern as actually what's happening with the environment itself. And I appreciate you and the Extinction Rebellion movement that seems to be really pushing back against that.
Yeah, I think there's something going on with the media at the moment, which is quite interesting. We've gone from a state of kind of denialism and reluctance to face the facts and really talk about it in a serious way, to a place where, I mean, certainly the BBC have in recent times said, you know, we're not going to, for example, host climate change deniers anymore. A few people refused to go on the BBC to talk about climate change because they were trying to sit them next to a climate change denier to put them on TV with the using the kind of justification that those people are bringing a balanced argument. So there's a for and against. The idea that there's a for and against climate change, like, existing is obviously, I mean, it's not just absurd. It's also like a dereliction of public duty, right? And the BBC is a public service broadcaster, supposedly. So that's something that they've recently said that they won't do. But as soon as they did say that they would stop doing that, they then still hosted people who are well-known lobbying for fossil fuels and who've been involved in sort of denial campaigns. And I think at the moment what's quite interesting about the way the BBC's been reporting on the COP, from what I saw, was that, you know, it always has to come back to a question about jobs, and it's always there's always a sort of contentious question around the economy, which is sort of leads you to feel that a green sort of future is unrealistic somehow, you know, or doesn't fit in with our current kind of paradigms. But also on this coal mining thing, because of the COP being in Poland and Poland having so much money in coal, they profiled these coal miners, and weirdly, like, you know, they present how rough it'll be for these people to lose their jobs, but they also profiled quite heavily on like how bad it is for their children and how their kids have all got like chronic asthma, and all of the sort of like health concerns that there are around the coal industry. So and that seemed to me quite strange as well. Do you know what I mean? To like report on COP but then bring in loads of kind of mixed messages really about like public health, and which is obviously nothing to do with climate change. Yeah, it's bad, but it's not the same thing, is it? It's climate change. And then to bring all this economic sort of argument for the fossil fuel industry creating jobs. It's just, I feel like the whole thing is kind of so chucking so many things into the pot so that you can't sort of rationally have a proper argument about it or a proper conversation. That's how it feels to me at the moment.
Yeah, it's, even out in the United States here, where you got around West Virginia and Kentucky, they have these coal mining towns that are really just destroying not only the environment, but destroying cities. I mean, people with the health hazards are stuck in homes that they can't afford to leave because they're worth nothing. And you're seeing all these health effects, and you think that they would link that to climate change as opposed to just the economy. That's what surprises me. I guess it really doesn't surprise me because they're a profit-driven business. But one thing I appreciate that what you're doing too is it almost feel like sometimes I feel like personally I'm in an insane environment where I see this world dying, but it's like I'm not allowed to talk about it or acknowledge it, or I need to be polite about it. And you all are coming out there and pointing that out. And one thing I was wondering is, I saw in one of the interviews you did that in particular with this movement, that there was a bunch of people that before it formed and launched, that you all were studying and researching past movements to figure out what you wanted to do with this movement. So was it a calculated thing to use the word extinction in the movement's name?
Oh yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people have asked me about this name because I think they find it quite sort of aggressive. And as you say, feeling like you can't, like you need to sort of be polite about things. This movement isn't about politeness for sure. And I'm really glad that we went with the name that we did. I'd say like the rebellion word is just a very practical choice because we'd sort of been talking about what it is, and it's not a revolution. This is definitely, technically we thought rebellion is the thing that's required. So that name, that part of the name was like simple because that's just technically what we decided it would be. But to team that with extinction, I think really it kind of came from this lecture that's been given around the country all summer called Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. And that was like the basis of the sort of community mobilizing work that's been going on all year. And yeah, this year, the PNAS paper about tipping points in the global climate system, that was one of the first, or maybe is the first, I'm not sure, scientific paper that I've heard about that's come out in the context of climate change that has like referenced the future possibility of human extinction. There are very few voices saying things like that. And it seemed quite startling this year that it was alluded to in that paper that what we've got in the atmosphere already and the carbon lag, the effect, the lag on the effect that it takes, and the pace with which we're still polluting, could mean that we have a 1 in 20 chance, I think it is, of tipping the Earth's climate systems into a sort of catastrophic snowballing state of climate change, which would be unstoppable. And so what scientists are describing that as is, it's like you wouldn't get on an aeroplane that had a 1 in 20 chance of crashing. People wouldn't get on those planes, but we're putting our children on that plane. And that seemed really that really sort of struck a chord. And And we just thought, why not go all out on the extinction front? Because also, we're in the midst of this mass extinction event, and it's also important that this isn't just a campaign on climate change, because everything's dying. So it's that kind of it's important that that's also part of the message. Ecological sort of collapse is broader than climate change. It's just a shame that we seem to have sort of poisoned the earth so badly, destroyed the soil so much, and also have climate change all kind of coming together at the same time. And you don't really capture that if you just have a conversation about climate. So that's why it's called Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, and I think you have to have a conversation about just our way of life. I mean, people have to envision a whole different way of life that it seems almost impossible for them to do. And I'm not putting words in your mouth saying that these are necessarily things that you or the movement is endorsing, but when I look at things, it's more to like, can we imagine our lives without capitalism? Can we imagine our lives without going to a job and reporting to somebody? And I don't see many people being able to do that, but it's these things that are not only killing the planet, but it's also keeping us away from one another, because life's so hard as it is to get by that the time we have to fight against what we're up against is limited. Our lives are so managed. That's how I feel is, just sometimes just trying to go out and protest, and even just to arrange an interview for this radio show for me is so hard because of how much my life is managed, of how many other obligations I have to keep living in this planet. And the thing I like too about what you're doing is you're changing the narrative. Is I see a lot of people say, if you use the word extinction or you talk about the possibility that humans could go extinct due to what's happening in our climate in the near term, it promotes this inaction. You can't say that because then nobody's going to do anything about it. And I think you all are changing that narrative and showing that, yes, we may be up against, it may be too late, but we are still going to do something about this.
Yeah, I think it's really important. We've talked a lot about like shifting the Overton window, right, and trying to change the public discourse. And I'm really excited about the fact that we might be just having a positive impact on that front, because I think if people can't even use appropriate language to describe something, then of course we can't all kind of like understand it and get our heads around it. But I also think there is of course like an issue with people not knowing what the future might look like if we did make the necessary changes. The chief of the UN said we need to make unprecedented changes to all aspects of life, like within 18 months, to have any hope of like changing course in a drastic enough fashion to avert the worst of this. And we're already committed to something that's pretty bad, quite frankly, anyway, because of 30 years of ignorance and willful blindness and inaction. And so there is a difficulty, I think, with the urgency of the situation and the kind of lack of imagination for what life could be like, how things could be different. And we're working to try to sort of decentralize and rearrange the way that we sort of organize, because obviously this has gone from being like very few people to a global movement that's apparently has a presence in 35 countries or something within like a month and a half or 2 months. And that's something that like is incredibly difficult to deal with, obviously, because you can't grow like that without some problems along the way. But we've been talking to this. We've got some sort of mentoring going on with this woman, Mickey Kashtan, and she's kind of an expert in um, kind of like decentralized sort of organizations, let's say, and sort of theories of collaboration and how to sort of like structure something like this that's totally decentralized but still functional, and trying to like combat that like idea of a normal hierarchy and like how people get like bossed around top down. Like lots of people come into what we've been doing and they want to help, but they don't necessarily know what they want to do straight away. And we organise in these sort of like self-governing, like small working groups, which are all kind of linked together, and there's no mass consensus that happens. So there's like principles and values, and then you can, as long as you behave and you act in a way that like meets those values, then you can just get on with your job. Do you know what I mean? So like groups or individuals get given like mandates for things that they need to try and achieve, and that's their job. And even just trying to work without a sense of kind of very ordinary domination or like hierarchy is extremely difficult, and you can see it in yourself and all the people around you when you're trying to work in a different way, if you know what I mean. And you know, we've been talking about the differences between like delegation and distribution of work. How do you share responsibility rather than like give other people work? Do you know what I mean? So it's really like there's something about the way that we're like trying to organize, which is to totally reimagine like the way that we sort of interact with each other and the way that we operate and the way that we build something like this, so that it doesn't just replicate loads of the sort of patterns that give us systems that have created these problems, if you see what I mean. So we're trying to do quite a lot with it, aside from the sort of like radical, you know, arrests, lots of press, all of this stuff. There's also something inherently inspiring about the way that these people that I'm working with are trying to reorganize the concept, I guess, of like organization. And that just feels really important to me. I spoke to somebody a while ago who's a friend of a friend and said, you know, I've just been really excited about maybe, you know, what the solutions to these problems might be. And of course, like working less is definitely good for the planet. Like I also think it's really a cool idea. But when I said to this guy who like works in a pub, gets paid quite badly, is a musician in a band, and I thought at the suggestion of a 3-day working week would be like, oh great, that would be great. Yeah, you're right. That would be really nice. His response to me was like, oh, well, if I worked 3 days a week, I just don't know what I'd do with all the rest of my time. I think that would be a bit difficult for me.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, we've really got a problem here. Like, if people can't imagine having a nicer life,
Yeah.
working less hours.
Well, a perfect example is my father, who's 68, still wants to. He I don't know when he'll ever stop working, because he feels like he'll be depressed if he ever stops. You know, even if he dials it back to where he's at now, because that gives him meaning. And I think that's such a huge problem in our society, particularly in Western society, is we identify so much of our community as with our jobs and with sports teams, and instead of with who's around us in our actual community. We put up barriers against people. You know, here in America, everyone has fences, so you don't even get to see your neighbors. A lot of people don't know many of their neighbors, and I see that as such a big problem here that we need to get past, is just this meaningful work. But one thing that you talked about, especially with how you're setting up the structure, and not really structure, but how you're moving forward with this movement and trying to grow it. And some questions I had for you as being experienced in different movements is, I saw that you were trying, while you're doing all this, you're putting in methods that would accommodate up to 2 million people. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the aim. I think it's based that figure's kind of based on research. So to look at successful non-violent movements of the past, including the civil rights movement, obviously, you can sort of look at the size of a country and the number of people that are mobilized during a movement or an uprising or whatever, and then you can kind of compare those figures from different data sets and see what's the kind of average number of people per the size of the country. And we've kind of estimated that it would be good to mobilise about 2 million people in the UK. As a majority of people during a movement or like a struggle for social justice, like they're not, most people are just like doing their normal thing, right? Like they're just going to work and going home and feeding their kids, and nothing that much changes. But the number of people that you need to be actively engaged is we think possibly about 2 million. And then of those 2 million, they need to be active, but they don't need to all be people who are like going out doing direct action, because obviously you need huge numbers of people to support activists that go out and do these sort of marches and acts of disobedience. So yeah, so that's we've come from a research. It's not my research, by the way, but that's come from research. That's sort of estimate. So then from knowing that, you can kind of work backwards and think, well, if we need to build something now that can be a useful sort of network for 2 million people, then that's it's ambitious, but that's something to sort of work on, if you know what I mean.
But I like the idea also of the fact that you all are giving people tasks to do, because here in Portland, I just moved to Portland, Oregon in April, and around end of June, early July is when all of these things were happening with our immigration policy, where children were being separated from their families at the border, and there was people were occupying some of the federal buildings around where the immigration, customs, and enforcement offices were located. And there was a big ongoing occupation in Portland that I went to for several days and reported on it and gave favorable coverage, of course. But towards the end, I felt like I wasn't welcome there anymore. And I think what happens if you just kind of let people congregate and talk is there's a lot of different spectrums of political views coming into that mix. And sometimes what I've noticed is it becomes this contest of purity, of who's the most pure of them all and who's the most righteous. And if you're not as righteous as this group, you're out. And that's what started happening to a lot of people that were reporting on the occupation and giving it favorable coverage, is we didn't feel welcome anymore because we weren't viewed as pure by the way we dressed or the way we looked. And I think that's such an important thing in movements, is to try and manage those spectrums of maybe people are at different places with the environment, but they agree that there's this urgency, but they don't, maybe some people say we have till 2100, some people say we need to act now, but it seems like it would make sense if you gave people tasks that would help manage some of those slight disagreements or disagreements within the movement.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are important about, like, having people who are like independently responsible for work that they can carry out in whatever way they see fit, to achieve the result. If it's your job to sort of manage a certain type of like promotion of an event, then nobody's going to complain about the way that you do it necessarily, so long as you do it in the way that you think is the best way that you can do. And when you give people this responsibility to take on like tasks and then just undertake them in whichever way they think is the best for them, then you see that people sort of take this kind of they take hold of that job and they find a creative way to work with it. Do you know what I mean? And people sort of feel if you give people responsibility, then they generally do a much better job of something than if you give them a little task and say, overall, I'm responsible for this, but can you just do this small part? That's the problem. That's delegation, and it doesn't really get the best out of people, I don't think. But also the other thing I would say about people coming in with like from various ideological sort of backgrounds or whatever, we've been criticised by some people for saying that this is a non-political movement, or that this is like an apolitical issue. Of course, like politics is in everything, and that's not something that you can claim that this is totally not going to end up being a political situation. But the issue is really that like politics can't seem to deal with it, and so I think it's really important that to like grasp the seriousness of the situation, we all need to put politics down for a minute and take science seriously, and those two things don't like coexist in a very healthy way in my lived experience. And so I think it's important to like get people just onto this get people onto the same page where they're admitting that we're facing this kind of mass existential threat, and your political ideology won't save you from this. Climate change doesn't really care whether you're a conservative or a liberal or even a green. The problem is that like everybody has to act to change this situation, and it's going to take everybody to do it. And if you need everybody to be involved in something for it to work, then you've got to come at that, I think, from an emotional place, from a heart-led place, and from somewhere where you can like find quite deep compassion and understanding. And I think that it's crucial to say to people, you're not excluded from this if you eat meat, you're not excluded from this if you drive a car, you're not excluded from this if you're a conservative or if you're a liberal or it doesn't matter. Like what matters is that we all need to find a way to like act together to stop our children from witnessing the end of the human race, which is possible. And so for me, I think something that's been has come through really brilliantly, and this is definitely thanks to like some other people who've been involved in this sort of building of the momentum that's gone into starting this movement. There's some of the people who are in the sort of founding team who've definitely built this like on principles and values which allow for you to sort of talk about politics and economics and the environment, and also about like having a human heart and having emotions and having feelings. And I think that the emotional kind of side of what we've brought to the table is possibly the thing that's like been the game changer in that, like, campaigns or movements for the environment don't normally lead with like conversations on grief. They don't normally admit that they're like sad. They don't normally say like, I'm actually really heartbroken about this situation. They normally try to give people hope and say, here's this positive thing. So if you give us £5 a month, you'll feel better and we'll all have a nice job. And Bob's your uncle. That's it. You can just like sleep easy at night because you've helped a movement, and we've stopped using plastic earbuds or straws or something, and like off you go. Now you can all feel like you've done something because you've reused a carrier bag. It's like, that's just not been working for a start. It's not been doing anything to the magnitude of what needs to happen. But also it's just like not cool to like lead with hope anymore because there's so little of it left, frankly. And I think the emotional aspect of admitting that and admitting how difficult it is emotionally to deal with, looking at the facts. I think that's been something that's really set this apart from other movements, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, you're getting into things a lot deeper, it sounds like, because it is true. I mean, I deal with grief all the time. I grieve all the time for what's happening. And people talk about the different, stages of grief, and I go through them all the time. Even if there's some acceptance to the fact that our world is going to change, and within a decade or two, it's going to be like something we can't even imagine, even though there's all these models and simulations that say these certain things. It's one thing to read it, it's another to go out and experience it. And I think that's such an important part of talking about grief and trying to make things not here in America. It's if I were to tell somebody carbon emissions are expected to hit 37 billion tons total this year, and that's an all-time high, they would look at that as a politically charged statement instead of a scientific fact. So how do you have a conversation with somebody like that and make that more about science? Because here in America, the problem is there was a study that was done by Yale, and it was kind of mind-blowing for me, but at the same time, it didn't surprise me, where they did a study and they said that 7 out of 10 people do not have conversations about climate change with their close friends or family. So 70% of people in this country aren't talking about the issue of our time with the closest people in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's well, it's horrible, isn't it? I mean, it's awful. That's why we're going to go and do this demonstration this week at the BBC, right? Because it's like, what part of the seriousness of this isn't being conveyed to the public by the media? Like, what should the media actually be doing about the fact that the public are definitely not well informed on this issue, and their children's lives are in grave danger, frankly. That's something that I think is completely unacceptable, and journalists are supposed to impartially research things and then report on them to the public good. Like, they're supposed to be there to share information that the public should know about. I think that the communication of this crisis has been, it's failed the general public very, very badly. The way that this has been handled by the government and by the media, which is why kind of one of our demands is like, tell the truth. The government should tell the truth about climate change, and it should educate people about it, and it should do that by, if necessary, partnering up with certain media channels. And I think, if we were going to get invaded by Hitler all over again, then I think the government would warn us that was going to happen. The fact that we're approaching a different kind of catastrophe, but one which is far more predictable actually than an invasion from an army, that's not being communicated with people. And I find it very hard to understand why it's so difficult for the kind of collective media to understand that this may be actually, now that the stakes are so high and we've let it get so bad, that maybe now that is actually, it should be part of their duty to really sort of tell people what's actually going on. Because I think the reason why people don't talk about it enough is because they just don't really quite understand how serious it is. They don't understand how far we've pushed our luck. So that's that's another thing which I really think the way that you force a public conversation with a movement is through disruption. That's why we've been doing all this disobedient stuff, because there's no way that the BBC would invite me to go and speak on the news a month and a half ago, before we'd done loads and loads of direct action, because they didn't know who I was. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's very quick to get that legitimacy of here's somebody who's part of a group that are worth having on a show because they're a credible voice on this topic. Why are we a credible voice? Because 150 people got arrested in 2 weeks. It's the disruption forces that into the public conversation, if you know what I mean. And I think that's really important, and hopefully through through more and more of the work that we'll be doing going forwards, it will become something that has to be spoken about more and more and more often, you know. And it should be headline news, shouldn't it? Every day people should be talking about what the situation is and what we're going to do about it, and trying to deal with that. And hopefully if you cause enough of a fuss, then hopefully you can sort of force that into the public discourse.
We have no other choice at this point. And I would say even some of the studies that we're seeing now are a little bit fabricated to give us that sense of hope. You know, even when you look at the UN's latest report from this year, they were using baselines from 1850 and 1900, but the Industrial Revolution started in the mid 1700s. About a year ago, I don't know if have you heard of Sam Carana before with the Arctic News blog?
Yeah, I love the Sam Carana story.
Yeah, and I know there's
the phenomenon that it is.
Yeah, I mean, I know it seems like there's several different people behind that. I don't think it's just one person, but I wrote an article about just kind of how we're being misled as far as the baseline goes. And I remember I had email correspondence with him about where is the baseline in your mind and where are we really at as far as global average temperature rise. And he said he's been using the 1750 baseline, and that really, this was in 2016, we were seeing temperatures at 1.5 degrees C. And, you know, here you have the UN saying we're at 1 degree, and that they're using 1850 to 1900, which just ignores a whole bunch of emissions that we've put out in the atmosphere. And they're saying we're going to get to 1.5 in 2030 to 2052, which I think is completely wrong. And it does try
totally optimistic, isn't it? Basically.
Yeah.
And this isn't a situation that I would choose to err on the side of wild optimism.
Exactly. And one thing I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if someone's asked you this before, I'm sure you've been asked this question, is, so from what I see going on in Europe, there's two types of movements going on that have climate change being the issue. There's the yellow vest movement, and there's your movement. And the yellow vest movement, it seems like it's still this blob of trying to form certain ideologies where you see some far right intentions, you see more left intentions, and it's very political. But at the same time, I understand why it's happening, to put the onus on the people for climate change as opposed to these large corporations and putting taxes on them instead of, you know, the people. They had it, and I get it. And there's a lot more violence and destruction with those movements, with that movement, but with yours, it's non-violent civil disobedience, but there is a strategy where I was watching that Guardian video where it was going around asking people, are you willing to get arrested? Are you willing to go to jail? My question is, what are the two different tactics that you see, and why are you choosing your tactics as opposed to what's going on with the Yellow Vest movement?
Okay, so non-violent campaigns of mass participation, civil disobedience, have, according to research, a higher percentage chance of success. So that's a kind of data-driven sort of research thing. I mean, also we're very privileged in the UK. Our majority of our police don't have a gun even on them, and there's hardly any countries in the world where you can say that, right? So we're in a very, we recognise our privilege in like the safety and the security of us being disobedient in the UK right now, because I feel that there are many places in the world where people are taking action on climate, and they're routinely killed, or they might disappear, or they might get tortured. You know, it's not. We're just we're hugely privileged in a global kind of context. to be able to say that we choose non-violence because it's safe for us to do that, and it has a higher percentage chance of success by the history. But I think what we've always said is that we don't also like denounce violence, like you don't denounce other people's tactics, basically, right? And where there's violent struggle, where that's necessary, then we're not saying that we're like non-violent, and that means that we can't be allies to people who find themselves engaged in violent struggle, because there's a legitimacy to some of those in many parts of the world. I think what's interesting about the Yellow Vest movement is that people have said to us that we've sort of, burst onto the scene and made a big splash, and isn't it interesting? And it's nothing compared with like going out on the street and burning a ton of cars, right? Like that, they've got a minimum wage increase out of that already, and it's really not been very long since that movement kicked off. So you might say that you might look at that and say, well, that gets even better results, right? Because they're already winning something. But I think that hopefully, I mean, we all need to have a big think about how these things sort of coincide with one another, because, we're not in a political vacuum. We're doing what we're doing at a time when those things are kicking off there, when things have been kicking off in Hungary, when the far right is on the rise around Europe and in other parts of the world too. And what the Yellow Vests are really, I think, saying is, just that we've been like pushed too far, and enough's enough. It's like the kind of forced the ideology of austerity, in real terms, constantly falling wages, constantly rising cost of living, increased like polarity between the rich and the poor, this sort of spiraling poverty and increase in wealth for the super rich. There's only so far that trajectory, I think, can go before people en masse say, hang on a minute, and this isn't okay. and my life just became a bit too difficult now. You know what I mean? And I'm really, really angry about that. And I think it's interesting that the environmental reason for the tax in France was the reason why everybody kicked off. And you could have seen that movement come forward and say, we don't want you to tax fuel, and we don't care about the environment. We just care about not being like treated badly as the working class or whatever. But actually, I think, as I haven't read them yet, but I believe that they've come through with a whole bunch of sort of principles and demands. And within those, there are points on climate, on the environment. But the point is that, like, yeah, as you say, the poorest people shouldn't be paying for the mess that we're in. There are some people that you can look to who are obviously the people that should be paying, and aren't. So hopefully, yeah, I'm gonna watch this whole thing as it evolves. And there was a Yellow Vest thing in London, I think, this weekend. Somebody told me. I haven't read the press about it yet, but I think there was a gathering on a bridge. So yeah, it might just pick up here, and you never quite know, do you, when that might happen, when it's something spontaneous like that.
Yeah, where it seems like your movement was more planned, as far as calculated, where this was a spontaneous, enough's enough. This was our breaking point. But with some of the things you've done, like occupying the bridges, and I saw that yesterday, I think your movement did die-ins here at shopping centers. How is the public reacting to you all when you're out there doing these actions? Is anyone coming up, and are you getting good feedback, negative feedback for what you're doing?
It's usually mixed in my experience. I've done a lot of roadblocks over the last couple of years, and particularly with those kinds of actions, you usually get a good dose of like angry public. They can sort of escalate in situ, and that can be sometimes quite challenging. You have to take a fair amount of abuse if you hold up the traffic for a long time at rush hour. But you also do always get lots of people that come up and say, "Well done. I'm so glad that you're doing something sort of with such sort of like determination about this situation, because it's absolutely impossible to see that anyone's going to do anything about it." And the public do often come over and say that we think we're with you, we think that's good. And sometimes, if you're blocking a road, like people who understand what you're doing just come and get in the road with you and have a sit down or have a dance. We used to dance in the road. We used to have little disco roadblocks, so we'd like cut the traffic off with a big banner and then have a little dance in the empty street. So sometimes you could get people like come in and join you like that. So it's usually it's usually a relatively sort of mixed response. And even like if you're spray painting a building or something, it's funny how some people will come up and say, "Well done, that's great," and some people will come up and say, "That's very bad. You shouldn't be doing that. That's naughty. That's graffiti. That's bad." And actually in London, there's also like a really big dose of people that just ignore it. They just walk past and go, "Oh, there's something going on over there. I'll just ignore that," and then rush past. They're sort of too busy to look at what's going on. So yes, it's funny. It's usually a mixed response.
Well, I have a couple minutes left, and I'm going to try to wrap a couple questions into one for you. I noticed that you have some upcoming protests you were talking about with the BBC, and then I was reading in the Guardian. I think you have April is a key month for you with a lot of actions of civil disobedience, and I wanted to ask you what those events are, if you could talk about them, as well as if somebody's listening to this conversation now and they want to get involved in the movement, what can they do?
Okay, well, I would, if I was looking to get involved in the rebellion, I would look up, possibly through Facebook, where the most local group to me is, and there are groups now, I think, around several in the United States. There are lots and lots and lots around the UK, including in Scotland and Wales and Cornwall and Ireland, everywhere. There's groups that have popped up in New Zealand, in Australia, in India, in France, Ghana. So there's people that you can find, hopefully, that aren't too far away. And we'll be continuing with various sort of actions and protests up through up to Christmas, with the BBC on Friday this week coming, and then there'll be sort of program of escalating action through the spring, and it will build up to the International Rebellion Week, which is I think the 15th of April. And at that point, there should be mobilization around the world, basically. So everywhere where there are groups, there will be action all at the same time. The rest, the details are not totally, I'm not totally sure what shape that will take, yet. There's some things yet to be announced or decided for how that's gonna actually come together. But that's the plan.
Well,
the next few months.
We saw over the weekend here was the first in the United States, the first Extinction Rebellion event, which I think took place in New York. So it really is spreading. And I saw on your Facebook page that there was a map. Someone posted a map of all the different chapters. So, definitely people that are listening, I would highly recommend to follow Extinction Rebellion on Facebook and go check out that map, Because like you said,
Yeah.
I looked at it and there was chapters all over the world. So
Yeah, it's exciting. And I think there's something else which is, if it's not already up on our site, it will be going up soon, which is a kind of organizational map. And so if you really want to get involved, like, and commit some real time and work to the organization of things, then you can get involved locally. But there will be soon a way of sort of accessing a map that shows all of the different sort of working areas of the organization. And you should be able to sort of see how all the groups are working together and connected and linked up. It's this beautiful diagram of all these sort of little coloured circles with the names of working groups, and it shows all the sort of connections between the groups. And you'll be able to go through that and contact, I mean, say if you're like a finance person and you've done fundraising for charities or whatever before, and you think I'd like to help to do something like that, then you'll be able to click through there and find the finance team and make contact with them directly that way. And of course, quite a lot of this work happens remotely. So sometimes we're sort of like coming together in little office spaces together to do work, but actually the majority of this is sort of all remote, and everybody's sort of digitally connected, and you can work from anywhere. So I would also add that, and we've been putting up like sort of some potential job spec type things as well on the site to say, like, would you like to help come and coordinate, get in touch. So if people want to get more involved, there's a way for them to do that too.
Well, great. And Claire, thank you so much for coming on the show today, and thank you for what you're doing. I'm going to be a father here any day now I could be, and my future son thanks you too, because his future depends on actions like this. So I want to thank you for coming on, and just say that that's all the time we have today for Moving Forward. You can find this episode and all episodes of Moving Forward podcasted at Podbean, in the archives at prn.fm. Also, now we are posting episodes on YouTube, or you can also find the show on the Progressive Radio Network's app, which is available for Android and Apple products. If you'd like to find more of my work, you can go to my website, which is robmovesforward.wordpress.com, or you can go to counterpunch.org, where I have a new article out that was posted on Wednesday. Thank you for listening to Moving Forward on the Progressive Radio Network.